When copper is heated in the presence of oxygen, it forms copper oxide. So in this case, we see that oxygen is added to copper. So whenever oxygen is added to a particular substance, we call that reaction an oxidation reaction. So in this case, copper is getting oxidized. Since oxygen is added to copper, copper is getting oxidized. Now in this case, we have copper oxide. When it reacts with hydrogen, it forms copper and water. So what is happening in this case? Oxygen is being removed. So whenever oxygen is being removed, that reaction is known as a reduction reaction. And in this case, oxygen is removed from copper oxide. So we say that copper oxide is getting reduced. So the addition of oxygen is oxidation. In this case, hydrogen. Oxygen is added to hydrogen. So hydrogen is undergoing oxidation, and copper oxide, oxygen is being removed from copper oxide. It forms copper. So copper oxide is being reduced, or this reaction is known as reduction reaction. So whenever in a single reaction, both reduction and oxidation take place simultaneously, that reaction is known as a redox reaction. Redox means reduction, oxidation reaction. So in a reaction, when oxidation and reduction take place simultaneously, that reaction is known as a redox reaction. Now let's observe this reaction, the reaction of copper with oxygen again. So in this case, copper reacts with oxygen to form copper oxide. Oxygen is getting added to copper, so copper is getting oxidized. Let's observe something here. If we see, the overall charge on a neutral atom we know is 0. So over here we have neutral copper, so the overall charge on copper is 0. We have neutral oxygen molecule. So if we take one oxygen, it is neutral, so the overall charge is 0. But two substances combine to form a compound only when there is a transfer of electrons. In this case, this is an ionic or electrovalent compound. They form copper oxide only when copper loses 2 electrons and oxygen gains 2 electrons. So copper, it loses 2 electrons, so it becomes 2 plus, and oxygen gains 2 electrons, so it becomes 2 minus. So what do you observe? In this case, copper from 0, that is it was neutral, it is losing electrons. So there is a loss of electrons, and for oxygen, we see from 0, that is from neutral, it is becoming minus. So it is gaining 2 extra electrons. So oxygen is gaining electrons and copper is losing electrons. So we know whenever there is a gain of electrons, we call that reduction reaction. And whenever there is a loss of electrons, we call it oxidation reaction. So we know now how the removal and addition of oxygen is related with the electrons being involved. So in this case again, we see that reduction and oxidation reaction are taking place simultaneously. So this is a redox reaction. So how do we compare oxidation and reduction with the addition and removal of oxygen and the gain and loss of electrons? So whenever there is addition of oxygen or a loss of electrons, that reaction is known as an oxidation reaction. Similarly, the opposite case, whenever there is a removal of oxygen or gain of electrons, we call that reduction reaction. So both oxidation and reduction reactions can be in terms of addition and removal of oxygen or the gain or loss of electrons. So this is how we get the oxidation and reduction reactions in terms of addition and removal of oxygen and the gain and loss of electrons.